Hi everyone, how you doing? My name's Nate. I'm a designer and a generalist at a studio called Small Jelly in London. And I'm also kind of an independent developer on the side. I've released a few games. And at Small Jelly, we're working on a game called Rocket Rumble. And it's a collectible card game set in space. And I'm going to show you a quick video so you have a bit of context for what I'm talking about in the talk. This is what it looks like currently. This is still very early. So you build your deck as you do in card games, and you select a ship, and then you go into battle. And you have these cards, you drag them out, and they become weapons, and you install them into these sockets, and then you fight like broadsiding battleships sort of thing. So we're about 7 months into development. We started in November. And so as you can see, it's still quite early. And I'll be illustrating the talk with some examples from the game, so you can get a bit of a glimpse of what we're working on, but also context for what I'm going to be telling you about PlayMaker. So just up front, this is not a PlayMaker tutorial. There are great tutorials online, so I'll leave that to somebody else. It's also not an advert. Like, if I'm going to be talking about visual scripting, and there are alternatives. So if one of them is more appropriate, then you should consider it. Do due diligence, But what I'm hoping to do is maybe to inspire you to consider using some form of visual scripting as part of your workflow. So this is mostly aimed at designers and engineers. Just a quick show of hands. Who would consider themselves like primarily a designer? OK. And what about like primarily engineers? Cool. And what about people who are like at a fairly small company, and so the lines are kind of blurry, and you do all sorts of things? Yeah, like a lot of you. So this talk is kind of aimed at you guys, really. I think for a lot of designers, visual scripting is kind of an inherently appealing way of working. But I am also aware that there's a real skepticism surrounding it, especially, I think it's fair to say, from coders. And I can totally understand that. I think to a degree that's kind of fair to a point. But what I'm hoping to encourage you to do is view these tools maybe not necessarily as a replacement for your code, if you are a coder, but it's something that can complement it and sort of give you another strength and kind of ease your workload. So at Small Jelly, why do we use PlayMaker? These are the kind of like key points. Like, it's empowered us as designers. It's really eased the pressure on our engineers. And it's allowed us to create this really effective, efficient workflow. Those are kind of broad points, but I'll dive into those in a bit. And so how do we use it? We use it extensively in all of our prototyping. We prototype absolutely everything in quite a lot of detail a lot of the time. But then also beyond prototyping, right into development, where we actually fully integrate it with our own systems. And then we use it throughout what we call this juice and polish pass, which you'd often think of as being the thing that happens at the end of your process. But actually, for us, it starts at the very, very beginning in the early prototypes, which seems crazy to be polishing prototypes, right? And then it carries all the way through to the very end. And I'll explain how we're able to do that, thanks to PlayMaker, really. OK, so what am I talking about? Just, again, quick show of hands. Who is familiar with PlayMaker? OK, cool. Essentially, it's a visual scripting tool. So if you're not familiar with visual scripting, essentially you build up what looks like a flowchart using this visual interface. And you can build up sequences and systems and all these sorts of things using this visual node-based approach. So if you've seen anything like Substance Designer or Max MSP or Mechanism or anything like that, then you'll be somewhat familiar with this kind of approach, although they have different results, obviously. At Small Jelly, we had tried a whole number of different visual scripting tools. But it just seemed like PlayMaker had the right kind of balance of ease of use and actual power. So what I kind of mean by that was we were able to get started really quickly building some pretty complex prototypes. And that was just a really quick process to be able to get these complex prototypes going so quickly. So that's a PlayMaker editor. It just sits right in Unity. And it's entirely based around this visual editor, which is really intuitive. It's really easy to get to grips with. And what you're building are finite state machines. So a coder is going to explain this to you a lot better than I am. But in the context of PlayMaker, essentially what you've got is a collection of states that you create. So we've got A, B, and C up there. And you can have one state active at a time. Within each state, you've got a set of actions, which are things that you either do or maybe tests or checks, like test the value of a bool. And then when an event is fired, either from one of those actions or from outside of the system, then you transition into a new state, just like this. And then in that new state, you run the set of actions. And again, it just goes kind of on around like that. And so these are the basic building blocks. And from this, you can go on to build some really complex systems if that's what you're after. So that seems kind of abstract at this point, potentially. So I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. So with PlayMaker, it is a visual editor. There really is no coding required if you don't want to. If you're not able to code, you can definitely start making games with PlayMaker. But even if you can, it's still a useful tool for you, I believe. You don't need to know any code, but Unity knowledge is required, right? This is not a replacement for Unity. It's not something like Scratch where you can give it to a total beginner and they can get going. But there are really good tutorials, so I think even if you are quite a newcomer, you can kind of get to grips with it pretty quick. So I'm going to show you this quick demo now. I'm actually going to build something in PlayMaker. This is not a tutorial, so I'm really going to fly through it. But the idea is just to give you a kind of a glimpse at how easy it is to get started and show you the editor and how it kind of works. OK, so here we've got Unity. This section up here is the PlayMaker editor. And as you can see in my scene here in my hierarchy, I've got the weapon controller, just an empty game object, and this weapon, which is this little red dude on the top there. And all we're going to do is just move this component, this weapon, up on the y-axis and then back down, based on whether the space key is pressed or not. So this is really rudimentary, I know, and the coders are kind of rolling their eyes right now. But hopefully you can see how you can extrapolate from this. So to do this, all I'm going to do is select the weapon controller, and in the editor, just right-click and add an FSM. This gives you your starting state, so it always gives you this. And I always like to call this initialize, because this is where I'm going to initialize my variables. So I'm going to just use this find game object action from the action library here, which is great. You just start to type in the kind of things you want, and it gives you this list. You can drag and drop. You can highlight and press enter. It's really quick once you're familiar with it. So over here in our state, we have a list of actions. So I've added this find game object. I know what it's called. It's called weapon. So we're just going to search for that. And I'm going to create a new variable here called weapon. So, well, I'm going to change that variable because I put a typo in there. There you go. It's also easy to change the names of variables. OK, so from this point, we're going to create two states in our state machine because the spacebar is going to either be pressed or not pressed. So to do that, when you can find your mouse, you right-click and add state. There we go. So that's our two states. And these are going to reflect whether the space key is pressed or not. So I'm just going to call it that. So you can see, just using really straightforward language, how easy it is to, at a glance, look at this in the editor and see what's actually happening. So let's call this space key is not pressed. OK, and so in this first state here, we're going to start adding some actions. So we want to listen for the key being pressed. So let's do a get key down. Just add that really quickly. And find space from the dropdown. And we need to create an event which will allow us to transition. So I'll just call this key pressed. So if you click this red box, it gives you the ability to add a transition, like that. And so when the key is pressed, it will transition to the second state. So in here, we're going to set the position of our object. So let's look for the set position action. We want to affect this weapon that we've already specified. So just find that from the dropdown. And then we want to specify on the y-axis where we want to move it to. And that's it for that. We also want to listen in this state for the key being released. So let's use get key up. So when the key is released, it will send us back to this to the first state. So again, just create an event here. Call it key released. Click this, gives us a transition back to the first one. And then when we arrive back here, we want to set the position back to 0 where it started. If you can type, it helps. There we go. Just add that, and I'm just going to set it to 0 on the y-axis. The thing I always forget to do is specify the object I want to move. That was very nearly embarrassing. And then we need to just hook it up to the start state. So we'll just add one of the default events, and that allows us to transition to this once the actions in here are finished. So in theory, once we press play on this now, in the scene here, when I press space, it will move to this new position. And you can see the state is highlighted, the currently active state. And when I release it, it returns. So just like that, being able to see in the editor what it's doing, which state is active, and kind of like the path that it's taking is really, really useful when you're kind of getting to grips with it, but also for debugging. Once you start to build more complex systems than this, it's really, really useful. And it's just a really nice visual approach. When I'm debugging code, I'm inept, but it's a real process. So this is a really nice way of working, I've found. OK, so we'll move on from this to talking about prototyping. OK, so I'm one of 2 designers at Small Jelly. We're only a small team. There's only 5 of us. But we've really found that prototyping with PlayMaker has really empowered us as designers to kind of do the things that we need to do and just get on with it. So we have really, really basic coding ability, my fellow designer and I. It's always just been a means to an end. It's not something that we've enjoyed like in any way, which is not a dig at coding. I'm just not suited for it. So with PlayMaker, though, we've been able to build pretty much anything that we've been able to design. Now, it's quick and scrappy, and we're not going to put it on Steam, but they're really, really useful prototypes. And it's allowed us to kind of explore mechanics and really experiment with game feel and this kind of juice and polish pass from really, really early in the process. And because we're not reliant on the engineers, they can concentrate on building the vital systems that, I mean, I can't explain to you what they're doing, but I know it's important. So because of the ease of use of PlayMaker, we are able to get this really quick turnover of ideas going. And so we're doing true rapid prototyping at this point. Now, this is great because it's not about saving time, rapid prototyping, really. It's about being able to maintain this creative momentum, being able to try lots of ideas out as quickly as possible. And because you're not investing loads and loads of time in the process of iterating, you're less attached to ideas, so you're more willing to let them go if they don't work out. But you're also more willing to try some slightly more esoteric ideas, which you may think aren't going to work out, but it's worth trying because it's not going to take you very long to do it. So I don't know if you guys as designers, if you've sort of sat in a meeting where you're all sat around trying to figure out how to solve this design problem, and you spend so much time discussing it to avoid wasting engineers' time that you just end up wasting your own, right? Like, I won't ask for a show of hands because it might incriminate people. But I've definitely experienced that. And what you end up with at the end of this is an entirely theoretical solution. It's on paper, and you haven't got the context of interactivity. So you don't actually know in practice if it's actually the right solution. So if you're able to just build an interactive prototype instead of all this time spent talking, then you get real, actual, useful data with that context of interactivity. And you'll know for a fact if what you're suggesting is going to work or not. And I think just more generally, it's just easier to communicate the intent of a design through something interactive that people can look at and put their hands on than it is through a game design document. And nobody wants to write a game design document, and like, good luck getting anybody to read it properly either. I think the thing is, like, as designers and coders, I think we know that it's easier to communicate through prototypes. But just far too often, I think as designers, we're not necessarily empowered to be able to act on this. I know certainly in studios I've been at before on projects, it's the tools aren't available, or it's just not encouraged, it's not part of the process. And I think it's a real shame. So that's why we have found PlayMaker to be a really valuable tool in this sense. So I'm going to show you a couple of prototypes that we built. And just for a bit of context, you guys can watch me look for a file here. We're building a collectible card game, as I said. And we have this kind of map exploration element. And this is the sort of thing that kind of binds the rest of the game. So this is the map that you traverse in between actually getting into battles with other people. So we knew we kind of wanted to procedurally generate this, but beside that, there were a lot of unknowns. So we set about just building a series of prototypes to actually just test this idea. I did want to show this in the editor, but it kind of got a bit lengthy. So I can show people in the editor later on if people want to see that. But here's a video of the first one that we built. Very linear. All I'm doing is randomly placing these planets on the y-axis, connecting them up with this draw curve connector, which is all PlayMaker does all that for you. And we looked at this and we liked some aspects of it, the kind of sense of your little ship moving around. It's kind of fun. But it's obviously too simple. It doesn't feel like exploration. It's totally linear. We are making a casual game, but this just felt a little too casual. So we decided we needed to do something a little bigger than that. So we went for this kind of sprawling approach, where you have all these kind of branching pathways and things, and the sense of exploration was a little stronger. Now, we're not building Elite Dangerous or anything here, right? So you can see this is not on that kind of scale. But for a card game that's going to be on mobile, that was the direction we were heading. But the problem with this was going to be a nightmare to actually manipulate on a mobile device. On a touchscreen, zooming in and out on that was not going to work at all. And it wasn't very readable at a glance either. It didn't feel, casual, to use this kind of like nebulous word. But what we ended up with in the end was we'd combined both of those ideas. And so I built this based on the previous 2 prototypes. I just took the bits from each that I liked and smashed them together. And so with this one, we've got this 2D side-on approach. It feels casual. You can look at it. You can understand what's going on. You can choose which path to take. And it has got this really nice casual feel. When you look at that on a mobile screen, you're going to understand what's going on. So the other things we were able to do with this actually is to experiment with our navigation. So how do you actually navigate this map? How does the camera behave? All of this sort of thing. So as designers, we worked all of this out. And we can just give that information and give these prototypes to our coders, and they'll know what we're after. So the outcome of this was really nice. We actually ended up with figuring out some new mechanics, figuring out what was kind of fun, what was not, what worked and what didn't, and just some sort of general UX kind of things that we figured out. So we're not going to use this actual system that I've built in the game. That would be irresponsible. But we have figured out the rules for generation from doing this. So we know how far apart we want the planets to be spaced and all of this kind of thing. What are the rules for the procedural generation? And so we can just give those rules. They're in our wiki now, and our coders can come and look at this and kind of understand what we want. And so that was a really, really nice process. And it all kind of happened over a couple of days. And we were able to do that all without wasting our engineers' time, which is really, really important. So yeah, there you go. There's some slides. Here we go. This is the graph for the first one. So the first version I showed you, the linear one, this is what it looks like in PlayMaker. So we've got some kind of stuff up here. This bit's waiting for you to press a button, which causes it to generate. Here we're sort of initializing some parameters. This is the magic bit here. This places the nodes at various positions and creates the end node, puts a ship in there, enables a camera, and so on. So you can look at that at a glance, or I can show that to Ben, my other designer, and really easily you can look at that and understand it. If you showed me that in code, I wouldn't know what you were showing me, right? So that's really useful. This is the next version. You can see there's all kinds of little redundant bits that we tried. These are all various approaches. Got a little switch in there, essentially, which allows me to change what kind of shape that the kind of star system or whatever it is kind of takes. So this is a big sprawling thing. But from there, we take them both and combine them, jam them together, and kind of refine the whole thing. And so again, we end up with this really nice refined graph. And again, you can kind of look at it. You can see what things are doing, nicely color-coded and all of that sort of thing. So this is a really useful prototype. We can come back to this really easily and build on it because it's nice and robust. So some more slides. OK, so from this, we kind of go from prototyping into development where we actually integrate it with our systems. But before I do that, I want to take just a quick diversion and talk about this concept of like juice. So essentially, there you go, that's a picture of juice. This is a big part of why we have actually integrated PlayMaker into our development. Because it allows us to really get this really important aspect into the game from really early on without having necessarily an animator on the team. So, I mean, are most of you guys familiar with the concept of juice, or is it a foreign term to any of you? OK, that's good. That's a good sign. Essentially, though, right, it's about kind of making sure you've got satisfying responses to all player input, or trying to imbue digital interactions with a sense of physicality, putting like life and personality into all of your interactions, all your movement, all your button presses, everything like this. There's a couple of really good talks and articles online. Like Cluna Games, who did Crayon Physics, have a brilliant GDC talk. So like definitely watch that. And there's a Tomorrow Corporation article, the World of Goo guys. So they've got a cool article about rapid prototyping and juice, which is on Gamasutra, so you should check that out. I'm going to tweet the links to that as well after this, so if you follow me on Twitter, you'll be able to get those. But I mean, I think this concept of juice is familiar to everyone, but we researched a lot of card games in the process of gearing up for this game. Over the past 7 months, I've probably looked at dozens. And there's just a level of presentational polish that's really missing. And it's not just card games. So if you're making a card game, I'm not just talking about you. It's right across the board, not AAA, but anyone who's like a small to medium-sized studio. It's just frequently missing. And this is understandable because of limited team sizes and limited resources, limited time. But it's really unfortunate, especially I think if you're aiming for a casual audience. So if you haven't got a nice game feel from the front, like if you've got a menu at the very front of your game, which is really just awful to navigate, if the buttons don't feel nice, if you tap a button and there's barely any response, I'll bounce off that, let alone a casual player who's not actually invested in actually playing games. So I actually feel that if you get this right really early on and you actually pay attention and you juice every single aspect of your game within reason, that you can try and engage these players early on and maybe retain them for long enough to actually start engaging with the game itself and seeing the underlying mechanics. So with our game, where, as I say, we're building this card game, and there's a real-world analog for this that people are familiar with. So people have played card games and board games. They're familiar with the feeling of what it is to move, a really satisfyingly weighty die-cast pewter figurine around on a board, or slapping playing cards down on the table. There's something really kind of physical about that people can relate to. So we want to try and harness that in some way. We want to try and inject that into our digital version of the game, while also kind of exploiting the affordances that we're granted by the fact that it is a digital game, like putting explosions on everything and all that sort of thing. And this is where PlayMaker comes in for us. So we don't have an animator. We have an artist now, but we didn't until very recently. And we knew that as designers, when I say we, as designers, we knew that we wanted to explore game feel from really early on. Because as I say, it's really important. We felt it could be make or break. If we don't get this right from the very, very beginning of thinking about making this game, then what chance do we have when the game is established, and then we need to go back and figure out how to make it feel right? So we wanted to look at this from the off. So luckily, PlayMaker is a really great sequencer. There's some other sequencing tools out there that are appropriate for different kinds of circumstances, but for us, PlayMaker's been fantastic in this regard. So it makes it really, really easy to add that kind of level of juice and polish, and it integrates really nicely with your own systems, which I'm going to show you exactly how we do that shortly. So I'm just checking the time. Does that mean I have 15 minutes or 0 minutes? Well, I'll just keep talking. Did we start late or did we start on time? OK, all right. Well, I'm going to wrap up pretty quickly. Essentially, we have this idea in the game of the weapon installation, right? Which is where you drag a card out onto the board and it converts into a component, into a weapon, and you install it in a socket. I'd love to show you this in more detail, actually, but I think I'm running quite long, so I'm going to kind of skip over it. But if you're interested in seeing it, there's lots of information up on the blog, and I can show you afterwards in the speaker's corner. But what I'll skip to, what I think is really important for you guys, is how we actually start to integrate it with our code, because this is kind of like the key thing, right? So our engineers are building all the required systems, all the essential code they're building. All the game logic happens in our own code. We don't handle that with PlayMaker. It can do it, but for us, we didn't feel that it was necessarily appropriate. So this is based on the prototypes that we've been building. Then from this point, when we realize that there's a point in the code where we need to do an animation or something like the weapon installing into one of the sockets, our code will put in what we call a stub template. And this just has the key functionality that we need for the game to actually continue to run. When that's in, the game is functional, and that template goes into the project and it's saved. As designers, we can go back to the prototype that we've done potentially months before. We can take the bit that we like, snip it out, and insert it into the stub template, and save that back into the project. So the next time the game runs, and we can actually do this in runtime, which is really nice. The next time it just runs this updated template, and this level of juice and polish that you've added really simply is just in there. It's a really nice, really robust way of working. And the thing is, we can then go back to this template and change it as much as we like, as long as we don't mess with the custom actions, which are the orange bits that our coder has put in there. And it will just continue to work every time it's run. So we handle everything with this. We handle all of our button rollovers, the shuffling of cards, all of our animations for when weapons fire, all of this kind of thing is all handled in PlayMaker. So just quickly on that point, what I was going to show you in a live demo in Unity, but just to really quickly cover it, is the reason it's really easy to juice in PlayMaker. Don't underestimate tweens. So we just tween everything. And it can get you a really, really long way without an animator. And I'm really baffled by why this is missing in a lot of games, because it's really easy to do. I'm definitely not an animator, but we've been able to get some pretty nice results from just paying attention to tweens, easing, thinking about the rhythm of your sequences, so putting in little pauses in your sequences, whether that's like 0.1 or 0.2 of a second. All of this stuff really makes a huge difference. The last thing I'll really touch on before I'll wrap up is it's been really, really easy for us to customize and expand PlayMaker to fit with our particular way of working. So we have our own custom systems in the game. We have our battle manager. We have our platform-independent input system. We have a custom rendering engine that we've written to deal with all our cards and everything. And for that to communicate with PlayMaker, our coders have been able to write some custom actions really simply that allow those things to communicate. And now, I haven't been super involved in that. As I say, I don't understand what they're doing. But they assure me that it's really, really simple to do. And they promised me, they told me in stand-up the other day that they are really glad that we implemented PlayMaker. And this is coming from coders who, a few months ago, were totally skeptical about using any visual scripting in the project. To the point where the other day we were discussing our menu system. We had prototyped it. And we showed the prototype to the coders. And they were like, well, you've done it. There's no point writing a menu system now. Just put that in the game, we'll tidy it up, and away you go. So it is a really, really good system. OK, so just to wrap up, as I say, it's really empowered us as designers. We can go ahead and prototype anything we want, and we're able to do that without any kind of restrictions. We're not constantly bashing our head up against the code, trying to figure out why it isn't working. And crucially, it's been enjoyable. So as a designer, to be able to prototype, in the past when I've released games that I've written in C#, sort of, I get there, but it's always a means to an end, and it kind of ruins the process for me. But I'm now making all my prototypes and all my independent games using PlayMaker because it's just far more enjoyable for me. It really has eased the pressure on our coders because this whole template system, the way that we're using that allows us to kind of use those stub templates to make sure that we've got a functional game. And then as designers, we can come in and tidy them up and juice them and polish them in our own time without those two work streams kind of conflicting. And as I just showed you, it really has adapted to our system, to our way of working really nicely. So that's us, smalljelly.com. I've just at lunchtime put up a blog there which has this presentation, so you can see some of the slides I had to kind of jump over. The bits that I missed out from showing you in Unity, I'll actually make some video of that, and I'll put that up on the site as well. If you follow me on Twitter, I'm gonna tweet some links to some of this stuff as well. I hope that's been of use to you guys. I know I flew through that, so maybe when you watch it back on YouTube, you can put it at like 0.5 speed and extract some useful information.